We'll call the meeting to order. Al, would you call the roll, please?
Yes, Tammy Ben,
Yeah.
thank you. Nicole Chaput,
I'm here.
Joseph Dugan,
Here.
John Eppers,
Here.
Jennifer Finney,
Here.
Matthew Heil,
Here.
Jean Kirkton.
Here.
I am here. Michael Yoakley,
Here.
Paul Dribbin,
Here.
Melissa Johnson.
And Melissa said she cannot make it tonight. Okay, we'll move on to the approval of the minutes. They've been distributed. Did anybody have a correction?
Yeah, I wasn't listed as being present for that meeting, but I was.
Okay.
I apologize. I will make that change.
Any other changes, corrections?
Was it included in the minutes? I thought I didn't see it, but it might have been there that we discussed modifying the schedule in the future to once a month instead of twice a month.
Well, that's, we're going to discuss that at the end today, all the timing and meetings and that. So unless there's any further corrections or additions, somebody want to make a motion to approve the minutes as amended?
I'll move.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
So moved. Public comment. Do we have anybody from the public? Nobody in the audience?
I don't see any hands raised.
Okay. Move on to governance, and there's nothing really there. The new business, it'll be a year next month that the Hicks-Carter-Hicks survey was presented to council, and we're delighted to have them present to us tonight related to DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion as it relates to public policy and local government. And Dr. Peoples, you want to introduce our speaker?
Sure, thank you. I appreciate that. As you shared, Hicks-Carter-Hicks did the city's diversity, equity, and inclusion work about a year ago. We certainly are not done with that work, and it's ongoing, but it provided a terrific foundation for the city as well as for the community. There was quite a bit of community participation in that work. If you're interested in it, we still have the reports available, and you can go back and watch the actual presentation. It's online as well. But it gives me pleasure. We've got Gloria Carter-Hicks with us this evening, and thank you for being here. I appreciate it. As well as, and Maya, I'm going to give you my apologies now. I butcher your last name, but we also have Dr. Maya with us. She is a fairly new graduate, so I want to make sure we recognize that. But they both just bring a wealth of expertise in this area. So with that, welcome.
Jill and Maya, you're muted. There you go.
Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Okay, I apologize. My voice is horrible. I would have been there this evening, but I think I won't share my germs with everyone. So Maya and I are online, and we appreciate you engaging us. We know that you have a charter review committee. This is a part of that discussion in terms of reviewing your charter and looking at it through a DEI lens. And so we're going to talk really today on a high level, kind of at the 50,000 foot level. We did not go through all of your charter and things of that sort, but we want you to think about some things globally when you look at your charter. My background is actually having worked for city government. I was the head of HR for the city of Clayton. So some of these things discussing charters and changes and things like that, I can remember back to my days when I was the head of HR reporting to the city manager and the CFO. And so I'm also going to share with you some personal experiences related to DEI and what I know from city government. My background is HR, organizational development, and change management. I graduated from the University of Missouri, and for a short while, I also went to Webster for their MBA program. So We enjoyed the opportunity to work with the city of Webster, and we thank you for welcoming us back again to talk to you from a high level perspective about things you might want to consider as it relates to your charter. I want to mention to you, interestingly enough, we work with other cities across the US. And so the discussion that you are having, we have already had with some other cities also, and looking at their charters, their bylaws, their policies, and the services even that they offer to the community in which they serve. I'm going to pull up this presentation. I'd like to make this pretty intimate. We had this kind of set up in a lecture format. And at the end, we were going to allow 30 minutes for questions. But I will say, if there's pressing questions and you think, I just need to ask this right now, feel more than comfortable doing that, because we really want to engage in a discussion with you. So let me pull up the presentation. I hope everybody, are you able to see my screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
Great. Okay. So what is this evening about? You know, it's really an opportunity to listen and learn, but to speak and participate, ask questions. There may be some things that are discomfort, but we know that discomfort leads to growth. And we would ask that, you know, that people may have different opinions on things about what we're going to talk about, even solutions that we might recommend. The city, it's up to the city to do whatever is best for the city. But even if you have different opinions, we think that is good. And we just ask that everybody assume good intent. I don't know, I heard the roll call earlier. I don't know if there's anybody from the community in the room or online. But you know, we want you to be able to have a confidential or a comfortable conversation about the things that we are going to share with you. So we thought from a foundational perspective, it is really best to understand what is diversity, equity, and inclusion, because a lot of times people use these terms interchangeably and they are dynamically different, but yes, they are connected. And so we're going to just kind of level set and say, here are some definitions to think about. And then we're going to talk about the role of the system and the individual. And when we talk about individuals, we're talking about, in your case, the people that live in your community, live and work in your community. But we're going to spend more time talking about the system, because the system are things like charter and ordinances and policies, rules and regulations. And we know that we need both system and individuals working together, that individuals work and make up the system rules. And so we're going to talk about how the two connect, but we're really going to focus on some of the systemic things that people need to think about in terms of making changes in their system. Maya is going to cover the different levels of the system. And we're also going to talk about something called the DEI ecosystem that is inclusive of, but much broader than, your city as a whole. And then we have some government and DEI examples, things that we know that governments, that cities run into that are possible problems and challenges, things like redlining, things like ordinance rules and building occupancy rules and housing rules and things of that sort. We're going to talk about some things that can be a problem and things that you can do to solve that. We have also provided a reading list from the Ferguson study, and also the dismantling. I think it was the 2018. What study was that, Maya? It was 2018.
Yeah, the 2018 Dismantling the Divide report.
Yes. And what was the other one, Maya?
And then the Ferguson report was the other one that we were talking about.
So we have links that were given to you in your agenda. But we're going to bring some of those things into the discussion, recognizing you are different than the other municipalities, but there are similarities. And some of the things that you will face or you are facing are things that other municipalities have faced, but we're not saying that this is you, but we want you to have some reference to look at. We will then also talk about best practices and DEI policies and practice review. So those are the conversational topics that we have for this evening. I will stop there before we engage further in the presentation and ask, are there any questions? And I must admit, I cannot see everybody on my screen. All right.
No.
Feel free to drop things into chat also, and Maya and I will observe chat when we're not presenting. So, what is diversity? You know, people have many different definitions and thoughts around diversity, and we haven't captured everything here in this particular illustration, but it covers all of us. Diversity is about our similarities, and it is about our differences. And I do remember when I was on a plane for a 3-hour flight. I was on a plane and there was a person in the middle seat, and we were from St. Louis to Seattle, and we engaged in a conversation talking about, you know, small talk, what do you do? And this screen was up. And this individual said to me, so what do you do? I said, well, I'm a change management consultant, organizational development, DEI, HR, and I'm working on delivering a DEI presentation. And this person said to me, that does not include me. And I looked at it and I said, well, we even say any other differences and similarities. So we've tried to cover the gamut, everything. And this person said, I don't think DEI is about me. And I began to probe and say, tell me why. And he said, well, does it include white males? And I said, most definitely. I said, why would you think it does not? I said, even though, you know, you are in that group from a racial and gender perspective, that doesn't mean that all white males are the same. And he went on to say, well, it has something to do with my opportunities and my privilege, and I feel that we're excluded. I said, I need to make it really clear that diversity is about every one of us. It doesn't matter if we're in the same group or a different group. Groups that are similar have differences. And I said, and we especially need to make sure that everyone feels that they are a part of diversity. So diversity is about our similarities and our differences and characteristics, our intersectionality, but it is inclusive of all of us. And there's really no reason why today that workplaces shouldn't be diverse, considering the workforce, considering the recent demographics from the US Census, why we can't achieve diversity, because it exists in many different forms in our communities and in our workplace. So first of all, I want everybody to know that it's inclusive of everyone, and we all have differences and similarities. The next discussion was, so what is inclusion? So we went on to have this further conversation because, see, diversity is about the what, but inclusion is about the how. Diversity is a noun. Inclusion is an action word, because it means we have to go about intentionally involving and integrating the diversity of our communities, of our employees into our systems, into our workplace, into our policies. We have to take those things into consideration from a systems perspective. From a personal perspective, it means that I feel like I am valued, that I belong, that I am welcome, I am respected, I am heard. And I often use this scenario to say, you know, diversity is about, yeah, I got an invitation to the party, everybody did. But inclusion is about, was I asked to dance at the party? Was I asked to sit at the table and make decisions about the party before it was even planned? That gets into equity. So that I made sure that what was on the agenda at the party was something that would be welcoming to everyone. So we're going to even say that you have to go a step further than inclusion to really create an environment where people feel valued. And that's even around equity. But there are two parts to this discussion around inclusion. It is how I think and how I feel personally, and it is the systems in which I am functioning in. Do they think about the needs that I have? Now, we're all probably familiar with Maslow's theory. You know, Abraham Maslow talks about people's physiological needs. He talks about things like water, food, shelter, air. Well, cities provide those things for people, either through jobs, through housing, through utilities. These are things that people need from a physiological point of view. And it may even be services that they need in a community. And then the other thing that he says is from a safety perspective, that people need to feel safe. And I'm going to say that's not just physical safety, but it's psychological safety. But if we even think about first responders, police and fire, people need to feel that their services will be there for them when they need them, and that those services will be available to them no matter where they live in the community. They need to feel safe. And that they need to feel safe from the standpoint that they will be treated fairly and equitably in the community in which they live. So we can apply Abraham Maslow's theory not only to ourselves as individuals or the workplace, but we can compare it to what a city offers to its citizens. And then he also says there is the need to feel like you belong. That really has a direct connection to inclusiveness, and that you feel good about where you are, and that you feel good about even the place that you live, the place where you work, and that you can give and do your best in that organization, in that city. And that all those rules and regulations and ordinances and guidelines and things of that sort support your needs as well, because these are human needs. So then we go on to talk about from an equity perspective. A lot of times people think that if I treat everyone the same, that's fair. That, you know, treating everyone equal is fair, but not everyone happens to be equal. Not everyone has an opportunity for housing in a good community, for education in the community where they want, for the services in a community that they want. So some people get some of the things they want where others may not, but all the services may be available, but how are those services delivered? And so when we talk about equality, it means treating people the same, regardless of their differences. They get the same treatment, but we know in communities, people do not need just the same treatment. They may need treatment that is appropriate for them and for their needs. And that's equity. It's the guarantee of free treatment. Now, what does that mean? So let's talk about this illustration we have here. I want you to think of the fence as the city's policies, its ordinances, its laws, whatever they might be, its charter. That's the city. And I don't think you would probably be having this conversation, or we would be talking today, if there weren't some things that you think need to be changed in your charter and some of your practices as a city. But you see here, equality, we give everything to everyone the same. These three individuals both get to stand on the same podium, but their view is not the same. We have an individual that has a better view. The person in green has a better view than the person in red, than the person in blue, but we gave them all the same that they need to have access to city resources, to the organization as a whole, but they are different people, and giving them the same does not give them the same access or the same view. So equity means that we give you what you need. The person in green did not need a podium to stand on to have the same view as the person in red, who needed a higher podium, and the person in blue needed an even higher podium to have the same fair, equitable view of the city and access to resources of the organization. Now, we know that you cannot change things overnight, neither the city or many organizations or companies. There are system changes that need to happen over time. And until we can get to those system changes and make them happen so that everyone can have the same view without having to have a podium to stand on, that we're going to have to make some changes in our policies, which sounds like some of the things that you were thinking about doing. But in the meantime, as you can see, until we get to that perfect place, if there is a perfect place, equity means giving each individual, each person in the community, each group in the community, what they need to have fair and equal access, equitable access. Justice and liberation says, I look at the systemic changes that need to happen and I change them. I eliminate those barriers that keep people from having access. And so in doing that, we have moved to justice and liberation, and people can show up and be their authentic self, and they can all have the same view, and they can be who they are, and they don't have any hurdles to overcome. That is equity. That takes a lot of work. And so a lot of organizations are beginning to look at, really their focus should be more on equity, because if you achieve equity, you have automatically included people and you are taking into consideration your diverse community. So those are the definitions that we often work off of when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I would ask you to think about, how might the city be able to be even more equitable in its policies, its ordinances, its laws, its charter, and how you do business? Because that's kind of where we are going to head for the rest of this discussion. So the DEI ecosystem. We ask people to think about things outside of their governmental entity, outside of their organization. We ask people to think about things internally and externally, because we are in a true ecosystem here. So let's look at the city's ecosystem and an organization's ecosystem. You know, you have DEI principles and values. That's obvious for the fact that you hired us last year to do the interviews, the focus group, the survey, and to give you a report on the current status of your city. And so that said, you are thinking about the city's culture, its mission, its vision, its values, and what kind of statement that you have around diversity, what you espouse around your values, because that's important to individuals who work there. But it is also important to individuals in the community that may want to work there, may want to live in Webster, that do live in Webster. And so we also say the other part of looking at an organization or a city's culture is looking at its people practices, its policies and procedures, its processes, its systems. And systems can include things such as what you're working on right now as your charter, your ordinances, the things that you expect in terms of rules and regulations on how the city is ran. That is your culture. But extending past your culture, you also have to think about not just what, city council or your charter community or committee is looking at, or employees. You need to understand and think about what's on the external part of the city, outside of the city. Families, members of employees that work for the city, the people you do business with, what do they think about the city? One of the cities that we worked with said they needed to think about looking at making it more easier for women and people of color and disadvantaged businesses to be able to connect and do business with the city. So they began to include the city's economic division into looking at its policies and practices to see how open they were to actually enticing businesses to move into the city. And so looking at that next layer, customers of the city, what do they think? The community, definitely. Strategic partners, how do they see the city? Do they see it as diverse, inclusive, welcoming, and equitable? And so not only what do your employees think, what does city council think? What do people think outside about the organization? And going even further than that, we talk about how do you contribute to making sure that you are following guidelines from rating agencies and employment agencies and other agencies that might do business with you. What is your stock in the media? What do people think about you? So if you were to pick up a paper, what would people read about you? What do you want people to say about you that don't even know you? And so the ecosystem is extremely important. It's not just what you do internally, it is what you do externally that impacts the families of the workers that are there, the customers that do business with you, the suppliers that you work with, the community itself, the people who pay the taxes. So this is another part of DEI. And we ask that people evaluate and assess how are they doing in each of these ecosystems and how do their policies and practices impact their ecosystem. So let's narrow this down more of a focus. And I'm sorry, I thought I heard, was there a question?
No,
Okay, all right. So let's take a look at the role of the system. You know, we would make some general recommendations about things that, you know, should be in a charter. I remember one government agency that I worked with, they changed their charter. Their charter had to be changed to say that they no longer said things like personnel, but they said things like human resources. And they had to vote on that. Some of these system things do require, you know, changing laws, changing practices, requiring vote. And I would imagine your charter might require voting on changing. Would that be correct?
yes, it is.
Okay. And so then, you know, that's where the individual piece comes in, the citizens. Okay, they need to understand that they're a part of this ecosystem and it's about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so you're going to have to bring them along as well for them to vote on things. I remember one city that we work with, they were voting on some housing regulations and guidelines that they needed to change. So the system is not by itself. It is integrated with individuals in the community that are going to help you make these changes, but they need to know why. The other part of this is, you know, we often use a saying, nothing about us without us. So this first part of the system change is listening to what the community says. And so that might be listening tours, it might be surveys, it might be just engaging, having an open meeting and asking citizens, you know, what are their needs from a DEI perspective. We've done some of that in the past with some focus groups and interviews and surveys and things of that sort. But now you're talking about changing your charter. And so it may be asking those questions. We want to make some charter changes. What do you all think? Listening to what the community says. You know, there's some basic things that we say, use gender inclusive language, and I'll ask Maya to talk more about that. But, you know, we say, you know, don't use terms like he, she, her, you know, they, them, their, using more gender neutral terms to be more welcoming and to think about the different identities that people have. Those things might even require a vote for your charter also. But listening to what the community says, communicate your stance on DEI. And what I simply mean there, what we're talking about is communicate your philosophy, your belief, your values as a city, and why you want to make sure your city is more equitable. And at some point, how do you remove barriers and what barriers need to be removed and what you need from citizens to help you know what it is that would make the city more equitable. And so listen to the community, communicate your stance, beliefs, and values as a city around DEI, and then establish norms, policies, and I'm going to say ordinances, laws that support your philosophy. When I talk to organizations about recruiting, for instance, and it's no different from recruiting people to come to live, work, and play in your city. I say it's one thing to espouse diversity, equity, and inclusion, and to talk about how important it is to your organization, but your policies and procedures and how the culture reflects itself needs to support the words that you're saying. So we need to walk the walk, talk the talk. And so this is where the system piece is really important, and what you're working on, looking at what changes do we need to make. You know, it may be things as simple as when I think about, you know, when you move into a new house, occupancy permits. You all require occupancy permits?
Yes.
Yeah, most municipalities do. And so sometimes aren't there limitations on how many people can live in a house?
Yes.
Yeah. But we know that some cultures and some families, extended families, is important. And so it may, I don't know what your rule is in terms of the number, the limitation based on the square footage, but in some cultures, having an immediate and extended family in the house is important, and it might exceed your occupancy permit for square footage. Those are things that you even have to start thinking about, you know, and so probably in the past, nobody really thought about those things. I am old enough to say, I have read some covenants that have said Negroes are not allowed in this community, in this subdivision. And I read that and I'm like, is that real? That's illegal, but it's in covenants that date back to like the 50s or so. And so you have to look at your covenants and things of that sort and say, these are old policies, but they're perpetuating discrimination, and we might need to change some of these things. And so it's important to really begin to look at some of these policies from their origin and think that was a different time, and we need to make changes today if we really espouse diversity, equity, and inclusion values. So this is the lens in which we need to look at things. Right here is where the system now meets the word. So we're now walking the walk and talking the talk when our policies align with the things that we say. It says reward and desire DEI behaviors. There are some cities that we have worked with that have actually started DEI commissions, and their DEI commission is responsible for looking at some of these things, and they've been appointed by the mayor, and they report to the city council, and they've got a role and responsibility to make changes to make their organization more equitable. But they're diversity, equity, and inclusion heroes, excuse me, and advocates. So recognize those people. They may not be on a formal committee, so to speak, or a formal commission, but they are people who are trying to move the organization, move the city forward. The other thing is when you do these changes, some of them are going to require resources. Those resources might be time, money, technology, people, whatever. But if this is what you espouse, and it's your values to make changes, and you're going to implement systems, and you want to recognize and reward those champions that are carrying the message forward, just recognize that change also sometimes requires resources, be it human resources or be it financial resources. But this is where change really happens, but we must engage the individuals. It is important, again, I can't say this enough, nothing about us without us. And so finding out what are some of those things that people in the community want to see or expect around DEI as you go forward with making some of these charter system changes that support your beliefs and your values. People hold government accountable, and we know how they hold government accountable. They hold government accountable through their votes and their voice. And they will either support or resist, depending on if the norms or if the values are aligned with what they believe in. But we also know if we can engage people in the community and change is more likely to happen. And it is more likely that when you go for votes for some of these changes, that people understand why and what it means and how it's meant to make your community more equitable, more valuable, a place where people want to come to live, work, and stay and play. And so those things are important. These two go together. So exactly what is the role of the system and the role of the individual? We've pretty much talked about that. The system supports the individual supports the system. They both keep each other accountable. And at some point, you're going to have to go to the citizens and ask for votes to make change with your charter. So they need to have been involved in it. And that's really part of the politics of this process as well. And I don't like to use politics too much, but it is politics. When you have to go for votes, you have to help people understand what they're voting for and why, and what is in it for them as much as what is in it for your city. And with that, I will turn it over to Maya, and she will be talking about government and DEI.
Sure, thanks, Gloria. So we spent a lot of time talking about the system and the individual, but we also know that the system is more impacted by just the desire to do good and also the responses from citizens. We also know it's impacted by how the system's worked in the past and how that past affects the present and the future. And so that's why it's really important to understand one aspect that relates to government and DEI, which is systemic oppression. So I'm going to be going through on the next slide, there's going to be a few different layers that we're going to talk about for these onions. So we talk about it as like a layer of the onions because some things are a bit more obvious than others. And so we're going to work from the most obvious to the least obvious. But it's important that those who have a role in government do see and understand what systemic oppression is, at least how it could potentially affect the systems that they have in place. Because whenever we're thinking about oppression, it's very easy to think that, okay, this is just like, you know, one person is being intentionally cruel to another. That's typically what the definition of oppression is. But you have to look at this systemically because there's a lot of different patterns that go on. And oppression, whenever it's viewed systemically, you can see how all these different things interact with one another. And so this can help you sort of create that change that needs to happen. Rather than looking at things as individual occurrences, we could look at this as a whole system and then figure out, okay, how do we pick apart the system and start making some change? So we're going to start first with the most outer layer of the onion, which is on the next slide. And this is the layer that says that historical discrimination within institutions create historical inequity within those same institutions. So this is probably the most apparent layer, right? So what happens in the system has consequences in the system. What happened in the past has affected the past. We saw this in housing, education, workplace, healthcare, the justice system, and so many other systems that work together. So one example, and Gloria is going to be going into this a bit more in a few moments, was with redlining. So historically, there was this instance of redlining that affected housing, and so it affected how people could work and live in certain areas because they could be refused a loan or insurance because they lived in an area to be a poor financial risk. And so we saw that back then, that was affecting housing back then, and that's just how that worked. But we'll be getting into that a little bit more and some examples going forward. But the next layer is maybe a little bit less obvious. And this is that historical discrimination within institutions created modern discrimination and inequity within those same institutions. So for instance, we just talked about redlining just a little bit, but we still see some of the effects of redlining today. We see this with the Del Mar Divide. There's certain wards and districts in big cities like Chicago that still have those inequities that are still being affected today, even though redlining is no longer happening. But another example that I like to give is with the African American experience and how this group is still being affected by historical discrimination today. So if you look back at the timeline with American slavery and segregation, there's been about 404 years since American slavery began officially. 335 years of the African-American experience was incredibly unequal. We saw segregation, we saw slavery, these sorts of things. And I'm saying 335, and that's sort of a conservative number. That's not accounting for states and cities that took a little bit longer to finally redact their segregation laws and practices, some even as far into the 90s. But what we're looking at is roughly about 67 years since segregation ended. But if you think about this, you'd also think about how time is a resource as well, and how this can affect things in the past, have things in the past affect things in the future. So for instance, if we're looking at wealth in particular, the Federal Reserve has this great study that came out. And we know that time is probably one of the most valuable assets that a person or a family can have. So with regard to wealth especially. So for instance, reduce time for one group to both establish wealth and also allow that wealth to grow can put that group behind for decades or even centuries. So the Federal Reserve does this study every year, and they found that the average African-American family today will not be able to catch up to the average white family by today's standards for over 200 years. So think about that for a second. The average African-American family, it'll take over 200 years for them to catch up to a white family on average today. So even in the future, they still will be behind. And so this is something that the Federal Reserve has been publishing year after year to kind of give the most accurate metrics with this. But it doesn't feel like that should happen, right? Segregation ended. It's very easy to think that just because discrimination was made illegal, that it would just go away. And so this is the illusion of equality. And this is why Gloria and I really emphasize the importance of equity and why that's such a huge advantage over equity, or over equality, I'm sorry. Because the hope was before that it would just go away with time. But as we're seeing, there's a lot of statistics that are saying, no, it's not just going to go away with time. Things actually need to happen in order for these groups that have been historically marginalized and put behind to catch up, to make sure that everybody has a fair and equitable chance. So the final layer that I'm going to talk about is the core layer. And so this one is probably one of the more nuanced areas, but this is where historical discrimination within institutions create modern discrimination and inequity between those same institutions. So not only has historical discrimination affected its modern system counterparts, so like housing affecting housing, these systems are also connected, so they end up affecting one another. So one example I like to give is the example of education, income, and housing. This is the example of structural discrimination. So if you think about housing, education, income, education, we'll just start there, that can affect one's income. The better education that you have, typically the more money that you'll make, not in all cases, of course, but in a lot of cases, if you have some schooling past high school, and the more amount of schooling that you get, whether it's through the trades or through other academic ways, you typically will make more money. And so that income will affect what sort of housing that you can afford, right? It'll affect what neighborhoods you can move to. It will affect what types of housing that you can get into. And so that income going to housing, and then that housing will inevitably affect education. You might be wondering, okay, well, how does that work? Well, because your housing taxes are used to supply resources to your education, right? So more wealthy housing areas will have better resources, better funding for their education systems or public schools. So like better quality housing in some areas, or more valued, I guess I should say, not necessarily quality, but higher valued housing will affect how much goes into the education system. So the better the neighborhood, you hear more resources, maybe you have ACT, SAT, tutoring, maybe you'll have other extracurriculars, those sorts of things, which inevitably dictate where you can go to college, and then that affects income. And it's basically just a self-perpetuating cycle. So what this does is that this can result in some low income pockets and some really high income pockets, right? It keeps people within those certain pockets, and it's really hard to get out, especially if you're in the low income pockets, because it's harder to get into either fixing one or more of these things in the cycle, and then this can keep families in the same place for years to come. So this is sort of all the different layers of the onion, and these are the things that have been supported by research. But I do want to mention here, because I know that this can be kind of daunting here. The system is really vast, and I do recognize that, but it is not impossible to fix. In fact, by understanding that it's a system gives you that sort of a background to say, okay, so what are some things that we can fix? And then what will the result be within all these other areas? So maybe we're saying, okay, you know, I want to help with education. Maybe we can look at more funding for education or something like that. And that can help disrupt the cycle that's already happening and give people a better opportunity. So Gloria is going to discuss in more detail some very specific examples and solutions on the next few slides, and I'm also going to cover a few of them as well. So that way we could give you some more, maybe more applicable examples here.
I'm going to stay here just for a minute because Maya brings up an excellent point here about how this is a cycle. It's a core layer. You know, when you're beginning to look at your charter, your policies, practices, laws, you might want to focus on some of these areas that you can impact around education and housing. We do know that affordable housing in communities is extremely important. We're dealing right now with a worker crisis. And so, you know, it's difficult when people cannot live and work in the same community also. If there's not affordable housing, if they're having to take, you know, all these different transportation buses and trains and things to get to work because they can't afford to live in a community where they work. So affordable housing is important. We know that wealth creation comes with housing as well. Sometimes that's people's biggest investment in terms of their portfolio for wealth creation. And so when we begin to look at things like, or our housing practices excluding people, that was one of the reasons I threw out the thing about the occupancy permits, because it could keep people from living in a community where they want to have access to good education. And so when you look at policies and your systems, I would focus on some of the housing and education. Income is important too, but we know education leads to income, this is a cycle. And so those things are important. So let's talk about some of the things that we know are problems. I happened early in my career, I worked in property and casualty insurance. An insurance company that I worked for got called out for what was perceived to be redlining, not giving insurance to people because of their zip codes where they live. And so if you can't get insurance, you can't get a loan to get a house. All of these things work together, but redlining is illegal, but it has most of its implications are on people of color. And so there's an assumption that, you know, it's a poor financial risk. We don't want to give insurance. Well, I can't get a mortgage if I don't have insurance. So we're saying, look at housing policies and practices that might prevent people from getting the housing that they need. Look at affordable housing practices that might bring more diverse talent into a community. And so these are things to think about in terms of, can we do greenlining of funds, which says, you know what, I take in consideration that things have needed to be righted from the past. We need to right the wrongs of the past. And that means down payment assistance, zero interest loans for fixing up your property so that your property in fact can increase in value so that you can get the insurance or a home repair loan that you might need. Low interest loans, property tax relief. You know, again, we said earlier from a systems perspective that resources are going to be needed to make some of these changes. Some of those resources that are needed are partners that will work with you, but also economic assistance, because that's what the greenlining funds are about, trying to right the wrongs of redlining. And there are cities that have done this successfully, and we also gave you as a reference segregation in St. Louis, dismantling the divide report to review as well. Other things to think about, we talked a little bit about this, is just to look at your neighborhood covenants. I mentioned I saw some covenants from like 50 years ago that were still around. And it was shown to me and I'm like, wow, really? That's in the covenant. Well, that's the reality of 50 plus years ago. So making sure that if there are things that are discriminatory, potentially not legal, that those things are cleaned up in policies and practices and in charters that are very old and that need updating. Again, this is something that came out of Dismantling the Divide, the 2018 report as well. Forbidding land for certain use. I've seen, and I've seen it in some of the, I guess they would not be, I'm trying to think of what you would call them, for the subdivisions have certain policies. And I've seen some subdivision rules, you can't rent your property because they don't want rent. They make an assumption that, renters are not the same as homeowners, and that will diminish the price of the property. And so just looking at all of these covenants and guidelines for subdivisions and laws that may prohibit people from having access to affordable housing, fair housing that allows them to at least start creating wealth. And we've got let me just say this, we are not lawyers by any means, but here are some cases that we pulled out of the reports that we are recommending that you look at, the Dismantling the Divide. So just making sure that these covenants are not existing that could potentially be discriminatory. Relocation of city employees. I once worked as a consultant for a rural city in Ohio, and they were having trouble getting employees to relocate to their city to work. And so they partnered with the chamber, they partnered with some other people in the community, the real estate agents, to try to make their city more appealing to people of color, actually, because they were very far out in a rural area in Ohio. And so they were concerned they could not get employees that want to live there, wanted to work there. And so they had to establish partnerships. So you have to look at, is what your city doing welcoming to employees? Would you even be willing to relocate employees or pay for some of that to bring in more diversity into your city? But relocations of employees and relocation funds and some of those things that employers offer are is really expected today because of this tight labor market that we are in. They say we're in a recession, but there are still more jobs than there are people. And we added 200 some odd thousand jobs last month, and the unemployment is still at a record low rate. And so I am seeing cities having to do things that they normally would never do before. They didn't have to do it. And so look at your charter and see if any of those things that are in the charter would restrict the city from being able to do what it needs to do to bring in top talent. I do have a question for the city. What is there a requirement? And I was trying to find this online. Are there any requirements of who has to live in the city to work for the city?
There are just a couple of requirements. The city attorney, city judge, and myself as the city manager are required to live in the city.
Okay. Because the other thing, city of St. Louis, they had challenges there with police officers and things of that sort. So, do you live, and I get it. I work for the city of Clayton. Working in the community that you serve, I get it. But, not everybody can afford to live in the community of the city where they work either. So, just looking at those policies around who's required to live in the city and who isn't. And what you mentioned, Dr. Peoples, is pretty much standard, especially city manager, city attorney. And what was the other role?
The city judge.
Yes. Okay. All right.
It's an interesting thing to bring up because, as you said, support the city that you work in and all of those things. And so there's a lot of good rationale behind it. But in cities like Webster Grove, where the housing stock can be very limited, it still provides a difficulty.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last comment.
In a city like Webster Groves, where there's very limited housing stock, it can still provide quite a difficulty.
Yes, which is the reason for looking at developing affordable housing. For saying, you know, that we might want to have, and I know I've heard this before. When I have done this work, we've done this work before, and we've talked to other cities about affordable housing because people can't afford the housing as it is. You know, and I've heard people say, well, I don't want that in my neighborhood. That's going to bring in a certain class of people. And we said, we didn't say low income housing, we said affordable housing. I think there, you know, may be some difference between what people are thinking and what we are saying. Affordable housing doesn't mean that, you know, anyway, it was just an interesting conversation that people thought it may be bringing in to our city folks that we don't want in our city. So then I said, so really, what's the issue here about affordable housing? Is it you're really talking about excluding people from the community, but you have a workforce that is very thin, and you want to be able to have a workforce that lives and works in your community, but people can't afford the housing there. There's an answer to that. But I also know that answer comes with some baggage as well and concerns that people have. So let me go back to this just a minute. I jumped ahead too quickly. So that's really the things to think about around relocation is, do you have the housing to support the talent that you want? Are you accessible? Are you willing to pay for relocation and do some things that you had not done in the past? And do you have the latitude to do those things? And so, these are just some examples. Maya's going to pick up with wards and redistricting as well.
Sure, thanks, Gloria. So I wanted to bring in city wards and redistricting just because it tends to be a pretty hot topic. And there's a lot of different opinions on whether or not city wards or certain types of redistricting are needed, or if they're helpful, or if they could be damaging, that sort of thing. And so what I wanted to bring to the table was just, of course, what each of these are, what wards are, what I mean whenever I'm talking about redistricting. But really what I want to come back to is, if these are done properly, wards especially can be helpful for ensuring that marginalized groups who have been disenfranchised in the past have more power in their city and also have their voices heard. However, if it's done improperly, it can also restrict those same voices and take away existing power. Also happens with redistricting. That could be very damaging. So whenever it comes to providing a solution here, so if wards or redistricting are desired, you can do this as sort of a DEI friendly initiative, right? You can ensure that that project has someone, maybe even a group of people with both diversity, equity, inclusion expertise, and also working knowledge of what we were talking about earlier, systemic oppression to help advise, help guide the project, basically just someone who can act as a sounding board that can give you sort of like, hey, if you do it this way, this is what's going to happen. But if you do it this way, this might be more beneficial. So making sure that there's no groups that are either unnecessarily elevated or unnecessarily pushed down. So that way they still all have a voice within the city. The next thing I want to talk about is something that a lot of people don't really like to talk about, which is sundown towns and also discriminatory practices, even in non-sundown towns. So sundown towns, just to give you some background, these are all white municipalities typically, or neighborhoods that practice a form of segregation by excluding non-white individuals through discriminatory local laws, intimidation, or violence. Whenever I say non-white individuals, I don't necessarily even mean just people who are white by race. Sometimes these cities will also do things around ethnicity, those who they don't consider white. So if they're like ethnically Jewish, or even in some cases, certain religions that may be associated with this, like Mormons, those sorts of things, those can also be individuals that or groups that are pushed out in sundown towns. So it's not just necessarily about race, but it often does kind of come back down to that. But also, even if places aren't sundown towns, they may still have discriminatory practices. So they might have official or even unofficial practices engaged in by their government or quasi-government institutions, like their law enforcement, their DMVs that adversely impact certain groups. We've heard situations like in the Ferguson report of like driving while Black. That's one that may be unofficial, but it was still affecting people. We've got a client that we work with that's been really focusing on making sure that their DMVs are using chosen names and the pronouns that people present to them while they're at the DMV, so that way their identities can be respected. So not respecting those chosen names or identities or anything like that could also be discriminatory practices that could happen, that could really push people out of cities. So the solution here, though, is a little bit more intense, especially if a place is truly a sundown town. And this is really the formal dismantling of spoken or unspoken norms and rules. What this is essentially is a culture change. These take a long time, they take a lot of work, but they can be done. So things like leadership rejecting the practices very publicly, vocally, making sure that they're saying, no, this is not what we want in our city, this is not what we want in our town, that sort of thing. Also, formal amendment or removal of existing local laws or enforced practices that are discriminatory or adversely impact certain groups. There may be just some practices that they don't even realize that are they're adversely impacting certain groups, but they have been for years. And then those get brought to the table and they're changed. And of course, enforcement of those accountability practices. You know, it's one thing to change like a policy or practice, but it's another thing to actually make sure that it's enforced. And for a lot of people who maybe have been doing the same thing for the last 20, 30 years, it can be really hard to change. So making sure that there's accountability there, so that way people are trained properly, that sort of thing, make sure that they have the tools and skills that they need to start changing some of those behaviors. And then finally, increasing diversity of city leadership, and also those in organizations that are associated and also within the areas, but with a caveat, whenever it's safe to do so, of course, because you can't just bring in a whole lot of diversity right away and expect everything to just be fine. You have to make sure that all these changes are made ahead of time. So the next thing I want to talk about is something that Gloria's already kind of alluded to a little bit, occupancy permits and standards. So occupancy permits in some places may have restrictions on how many people can live in a home. Typically, a lot of places do the 2 persons per bedroom rule, and this can affect multi-generational households and also certain individuals and families, depending on what that language is. Some of it, a lot of things that have been outdated for a very long time, maybe even saying like, you know, pronouns or gendered things that associate, okay, what are the families looking like that can live in these housing. But of course, we do have the Federal Fair Housing Act, and so this has been really helpful. So the solution here is just making sure that the FHA is actually enforced, investigate any notices of rules, laws, regulations, reports of anything like that that cities or landlords have set, especially if they are expected to have adverse impact. And then readjust those rules as necessary. It's also important whenever you do have to do this, because if you're going to be enforcing a lot of stuff, you want to make sure that that person that is enforcing them has some expertise around DEI and also the Fair Housing Act. So that way they can act as a consultant and let you know, hey, yeah, maybe this isn't like the best language that we need to use. Maybe we need to change this a little bit because right now it could be excluding entire families from coming to our city, from moving into this complex or so forth. But also you could go beyond the Fair Housing Act. You know, laws are there to be basically a bare minimum, right? Like, but you could always go even beyond that. And some things like the Fair Housing Act may not always have all the guidelines that are like DEI friendly. So the FHA may not have guidelines on things such as the number of occupants to a room that you really should be doing to be equitable and fair. So ensure that equitable housing experts are consulted, listen to your community and let them tell you, hey, this thing is not really working. It's really helping. It would be really helpful if we could change this and really listen to them and see what the next steps that are most appropriate can be taken. And then the final example that we want to bring up is around health disparities. So what we know, and there's been a lot of research to support this, is that zip code is the top predictor of health disparities. Zip code can predict up to 60% of your health, and it impacts it through social, educational, and environmental resources either being there or not being there. And so there's a few solutions here because it can be very easy to think, oh, it's okay. We're a pretty wealthy area. This is probably not an issue. There's plenty of resources, but even some more wealthy areas with a lot of resources still have these health disparities. And I can kind of tell you a little bit why. And part of this is you need to be listening to those who are affected by them. So in some communities, it may be that they just don't have access to certain resources. They're not within walking distance. There's nothing on that side of town, that sort of thing. But also some communities may have been hurt in the past and have a distrust of healthcare. Things like just the Tuskegee experiments and things like that can really sow a level of distrust within certain communities to allow communities to say, no, I don't trust healthcare. Even if this wonderful resource is right here down the block for me, I just don't trust it because I just don't like doctors. And so really listening to those who are affected to figure out what the problem is, why these disparities exist is a huge solution here. Once that's kind of been figured out, then you can work with healthcare who have expertise with working with groups who have been adversely impacted. I know SLU and WashU both have this as a focus in a lot of their medical practitioner courses. I had to work on some of these whenever I worked at SLU for a while. I got to see some of these firsthand. And this is a really highly emphasized area, is making sure that building trust within communities that have been hurt in the past is there. And then finally, of course, funding is really important to both create and also maintain resources to ensure that all people feel that their local healthcare is accessible and safe. So these are the things that we just want to bring up with specific examples. I'm going to pass it back to Gloria just to talk briefly about other solutions, about how we can look at the system and fix it. Gloria, it seems like you may still be muted.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I'm having a technical issue on my end here, so I've lost the screen. Hang on just a minute. Let me get back to solutions. I don't think you can see me. Okay.
No, but we
there
can
go.
hear you just fine. Oh, there we go.
Okay, so we talked about the system a lot. When you're looking at making changes to your charter, that is the system. Ordinances and practices and things of that sort, that is your system. You're looking at it through a DEI lens, which is a very much a positive, empathy and trying to decrease biases that people have. We all have biases. That's a human aspect of who we are, but we need to know what those biases are. And just talking about these things that you want to do differently with the charter and having different perspectives on the committee, that's a good way of decreasing biases because people have different perspectives about things. There is no silver bullet. There are multidimensional things that have to be done. We talked about there may be ordinances, there may be covenants that need to change. There may be policy practices. You may need affordable housing. There may be a myriad of different things that are needed in order to move your organization more toward being equitable, moving the city to being more in a liberation mode than an equity mode. But starting with equity is a good place to know that equality is not where we want to be. Different people, different groups need different things, and we need to understand what groups need, what people need. That's the equity piece. And at some point, you will be able to eradicate some of those roadblocks and move to liberation. But equity is where a lot of cities and organizations are focusing right now. Listening to local leaders and experts, we've given you some policies from other studies that have been done. We've given you some things to read, some ideas and suggestions. Those are just places where you can go to get information, but we know at the end of the day that Webster needs to do what is best for Webster. You might need to tailor some of these solutions to better meet your needs and your resources, and understanding that you are going to have to get voters to come along the journey with you. So here are just some best practice things to think about. We said remove exclusionary or outdated language. Maya mentioned some of that language already, but I will ask if there's any additional questions about that. Inclusion of language that is considerate of backgrounds and lived experiences. You know, again, this is where we said nothing about us without us, and that really is the next policy, the next practice that we're saying you should think about. If you're going to be altering these policies, the charter in any way, you may want to get people involved and have conversations or listening sessions with different groups. Benchmarking against other cities of similar sizes. There may be cities that you feel are doing this exceptionally well, and you want to benchmark from those cities. We have recommended that with other cities, that they talk to other city managers, they invite people in, they go take a visit, etc. But benchmarking is always a good thing to do. And then there are some resources that we included with the agenda. That was the Dismantling Divide and the Ferguson report and some other things that we had recommended. I'm going to stop there and let's see, open it up for questions that you might have.
Questions? Well, I thank you very much. I wanted to get your perspective. This is a lot to digest. And so we plan to have public groups, meetings with groups in the future once we weed through the charter. But just thinking back at your experience in doing the survey, there are so many different perspectives in this city where people said, oh, you're doing great. You're not doing enough. You're doing just fine. Leave us alone. And we see that in, we had a vote not too long ago about establishing duplexes in the city where families could live together, which was voted down. So I think we have a lot of earthworms to herd as we move through this process. And is the best way for you to give us advice would be to have very many public meetings, or I just don't know.
Well, I can tell you the affordable housing topic with every city we have worked with has been a difficult topic. About the perspectives that people have about what type of community will exist with affordable housing, and the perception and the biases about, you know, who will that bring into my community? And so we know housing is a hot topic, but when Maya talked about those core layers, housing is a core layer in rectifying discrimination and unfair practices, that people can acquire wealth, have jobs, be a part of the economic cycle if they could create wealth through education and housing. And they can also be more healthier because they can afford things through education. It drives income. And so we know that thriving communities need to make sure that they provide those things in their community. I have a question for you. What's been the discussion? Because I remember maybe a year, 2 years ago, didn't you all have something on the ballot about affordable housing? Or there was a conversation I heard about affordable housing when we were doing the interviews and focus groups?
What did we have? We had the duplex.
I think what you're referring to, Ms. Hicks, is the duplex issue that the council
Okay.
passed, and then the voters took it to
overturned it.
referendum and voted it down.
What's the concern that people have? Well, I mean, what concerns have they voiced? Because I think you would want to hear that from the community so that you can negate those concerns or have a plan to address those concerns.
Some of the things that I heard was, property values.
Mhm.
not in my neighborhood.
Mhm.
I like single family, we're single family home neighborhood and want to keep it that way.
Yeah.
I'm sure other people heard different things.
There's a lot of discussion around character of community, which is an interesting concept to me. 'Cause I'm not sure I know what character of community.
Yeah, I was
means.
gonna ask, what is defined, what's character?
I was hoping you could share that.
I think what we have heard in terms of, I mean, really people are thinking that there are going to be people moving in the community that are not of the same socioeconomic status, same income, education level, same values, whatever those values are, that it was somehow going to diminish the property value of the city. And so they didn't want to do that. That's what we heard. Those are the comments we heard. What kind of folks that going to bring into our community?
I think it was expressed a lot in terms of people want single family housing and probably not anything else.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that
People
comment.
wanted, what people said was that they wanted single family housing and not, when they meant character, they meant single family.
So Webster passed one of the first zoning ordinances in 1923. And that zoning ordinance said that everything would be single family except for a few commercial districts. So we were the first in the county to do that, which doesn't speak very well of us, but it was 1923.
Well, and just what you mentioned, it was 1923. And so these are the kinds of things when we ask people to look at ordinances and laws and charters and practices, is that they begin to look at, you know, the age of those. Maybe that was appropriate then, but recognizing that we have a different type of community now, that probably won't substantiate the community of now and the future, especially if you're trying to bring people in the community to work, to be a part of the economic ecosystem, that you probably are going to have to change. Now, getting people to understand the value in that and the rationale behind that is the challenge, because now you got to get them to the polls to vote for that. So my question would be, if you do not change, what's the cost?
I'm thinking from our perspective that we are just looking at the charter and we really have no impact on ordinances. If we state our mission statement up front in our first paragraph to be one of equity, would that set the framework for the council to go move into their ordinances that are prohibitive and make changes that way? If we say, this is who we are and this is what we want to be through an equity lens, diversity, inclusive, does that starts the ball rolling? Would you think that's a fair statement?
Well, those are baby steps.
Yeah.
Remember what I had said earlier, is that, you know, the things that you espouse and value need to match the things that you actually do. So I clearly hear what you are saying about the charter, and the ordinances and the laws are not a part of that. But the ordinances and the laws are truly a part of the system
Right.
that we talked about. So my question would be, could you change your charter and still not achieve equality or equity?
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yes. So I think you all know the answer. You can change your charter, but it will not help you achieve equity. And that's a bigger battle in itself. But those are things, when I was working for this city in rural Ohio, they had some of the same challenges that you are facing. So they couldn't get everything done legally. So they started to try to work with the chamber, they worked with community partners and other folks to make their community more appealing to people to want to come there and work. But at the end of the day, it was still very difficult for them because some of their laws did not support the changes that they were trying to talk to people about to come there, So I guess what I would say is it's baby steps, this is not a sprint, it is a marathon. You got to crawl first. And if that is, I need to change my charter, that's a starting point. But that's not the finished work. And then you have to communicate there's other work yet to be done. Then you're going to have to rally the citizens behind that and get them involved, because now it requires votes, but it requires votes for your charter too. So my question to you is, do you think you would have the votes for the charter to be changed to be more inclusive?
Well, I don't know what the rest of the group think, but I think some of the things you talk about can be done without changing the charter. I don't see where the charter is a big barrier to doing most of the things you're talking about.
I think I heard you don't see it being that big of a challenge.
No, the charter is not a barrier to equity for the most part. I mean, you could get the equity without changing the charter.
So then the question is this: if you could get to equity without changing the charter, where do you need to focus your work?
Well, this group is focused on the charter. That's our mission.
Okay. All right.
Maybe something I might add then
Mhm.
is you can start with making sure that, if you feel that the charter itself it's not necessarily a barrier to equity, then what you can do is say, hey, yeah, this isn't necessarily a barrier to equity, but we're still thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, even whenever we're looking at the charter. So we're thinking about, okay, even though that, there's some, gendered language, maybe even like gender specific policies, binary pronouns, even things like racially fueled language, ableist language, disability first language instead of person first language. You did say, maybe these won't necessarily be a barrier to equity, but we're thinking about this even here. And we know that even if this isn't necessarily a barrier, we still see the importance of this existing in this space, which means that if we're focusing on this here, then that means that we should be focusing on this in other places too. So it's, this is one step of the bigger picture. And we know that everything's sort of connected. And we know that this is just one part of the system, but we know if we start affecting one part of the system, then it might start affecting other parts of the system. So if you make that very clear that even things like these are things that we want to consider in the charter, and that means that other things, ordinances, other policies can also follow. And they have some sort of groundwork of, hey, the charter focused on this X, Y, and Z. They focused on making sure that exclusionary language was gone. They made sure that they really included people who would be affected by these things in the dialogue on how we need to change these things. Let's try doing that here too, whenever we're talking about the ordinances, whenever we're talking about some of the other procedures that we do as, say, city council, that sort of thing.
And I would just add, there are components in the charter that absolutely deal with equity, whether we're talking about the pay for the elected officials, the wards conversation. You mentioned a couple of, gendered pronoun issues in our charter. There are plenty of things that, what empowers the zoning ordinance is the charter. Now, we're not going to, I presume, not throw away the entire, zoning ordinance, but there are things that are empowered by the charter that we can take equity into consideration. I think that is why this training is so valuable.
Yeah. I
So
think
I have
oh, I'm sorry, please go ahead.
No, sorry. I have a question. Do some municipalities use the charter as setting the bar and the tone for the change in ordinances and law. To say that this is a priority, that we want to look at that, and we've included it in the charter to make sure that it's included in the review of ordinances and laws. So from the top down, instead of trying to trickle it up.
The last city that we worked with, they had a commission that was working on, well, it was actually appointed by the mayor. And they had a commission to look at various community things that they were doing, city. They brought in, I don't know, probably they had 25 different groups going. I don't remember them, Maya, I can't remember them. The charter never came up in their discussion. We didn't even look at the charter. They were going to take that information, present it to the mayor, and then they were going to develop some sort of strategy around DEI. So I really can't speak to if the charter was used before, because we've not really had that conversation. It was really a commission we were working with. They may have had that conversation, but that wasn't the work that we did with them. And what Maya said, I mean, this is truly baby steps. Interject DEI where you can. And if the charter is where you can do that, do that. Change takes 5 to 7 years, depending on how large and how old an organization a city is. This is not something you can do overnight. And so you had the assessment last year. We gave that report out, what I believe it was in January of last year. You are now working on the charter. Over time, you will begin to look at other aspects. This is a never-ending job. DEI is a never-ending job because it changes daily. Things that we are discussing now, we would not have discussed 10 years ago. So this work is never done. I don't say that to be discouraging, that I'm saying that to be that that's just how DEI is, because the world, our communities are changing. People are speaking up more about what their expectations are in terms of being included, where they didn't speak up before. And so we have to be attuned to what people are interested in and what their concerns are and how we can help them feel included. So this is a journey, we tell people. And no, you're not going to just start changing all of your ordinances tomorrow. We spoke to you on a 50,000 foot level. So start with your charter. Do the best with your charter with the information that we've talked about and look at it through a DEI lens. But I will say at some point, you're going to also have to look at the policies and the ordinances that you rule by. But that may not be timing to do that now. That's not appropriate for you now. And it sounds like it's not within your purview either.
But on this behalf of the city, they are beginning to look at that language in their mission statement and things in that vein. So it's moving.
And if it's moving slowly, I would not worry about it. It's when it's stagnant and it's standing still. We were pleased to get a call to hear that you were looking at your charter. I mean, that is really positive work. So, and I don't know how much you are communicating about how this is a part of the DEI journey, but I would think you also want people in your community to know that this is a part of your DEI journey.
Also, I wanted to mention, I saw that Emerson had a hand up.
Yes, Emerson, sorry, we didn't mean to overlook you.
That's all right. I'm just glad you called. I didn't know if y'all were gonna let me speak or not. Just 2 quick questions. Maya spoke of the onion, peeling back the onion, and how long it takes for like, I'll just use the same example, African Americans to catch up to current items. In your experience, and then Gloria, you spoke of righting the wrong of the past. And I can see how you peel off those onions and righting the wrong simultaneously. In your experience, how long would it take a community to address something like that?
Gee, I don't know. Maya, you said the Federal Reserve study said how many hundreds of years?
Yeah, so with wealth specifically, I think it's actually more now. The 2016 report, which is the one that I have readily available in front of me, is like, I think 233 years. And I know it's gone up a little bit just because there haven't been too many changes yet. However, they also do emphasize, even the Federal Reserve recognizes the importance of taking steps to reduce that number. And they do provide recommendations for the country to consider to reduce that number, make it much more obtainable, and there are actionable steps there. So as far as righting the wrongs, it's going to be very specific on the system that you're looking at, right? So like I said, whenever we saw that triangle about all the different pieces that were connected, if you start to disrupt one, then the others might start to follow, depending on how much you disrupt it, right? As long as there's not something that undisrupts one of them so hard that it counterbalances or whatever. So as far as like making sure that a city is righting its wrongs, there are ways that a city can do that to not necessarily, I think that righting the wrongs is one thing, but it's also important to not forget where the city once was, to start benchmarking against itself. Whenever we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion benchmarking, we talked about benchmarking against other cities. But we also know that in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, it's also very, very important to start benchmarking against yourself. You know, where were you 10 years ago and how much has it improved? You know, maybe we can't right every single wrong because those wrongs have been affecting families for so long. But what we can do is we can start making changes to help, you know, make places where people can catch up, make places where, you know, we didn't have a space for that dialogue to where we're not forgetting what happened. But we are taking steps to correct some of those things and try to help people catch up based on that. There are some equity related policies that some places will implement just to make sure that certain groups can catch up. Those tend to be a little bit controversial, especially whenever it comes to a vote, you know. That's the unfortunate part. But in a lot of communities, it's also not so controversial. And that's been a lot of communication about, you know, making sure that everybody has a fair chance is helpful for the whole community. You know, equity, a lot of times people will see, you know, hey, yeah, we're helping this one group, but why aren't we helping everybody else? But what it ultimately does is it does help everybody else in the long run. And there's a lot of different ways. I can't give every single example, but, you know, making sure that, you know, if you're righting the wrongs and making sure people are catching up with housing, then that means everybody in the community is going to help. They're going to be helped by this. You know, you're righting somebody's wrong here. That means a new family can be existing in your community, and then they can bring what they bring to the community, and then that can only amplify further. So there's a lot of different ways. As far as actual time goes, it's really up to you all. It's up to the things that you like to bring in. It's up to all of those initiatives that you decide are the best way to do this. And you're listening to your community and figuring out what they need the most.
Thank you.
Of course.
Other questions?
Anybody else have a question, comment? Well,
I was going to mention this when it came up about righting wrongs. You know, one of the core layers happens to be education. Not everybody can afford a 4-year education, and many times now people don't want to take on the debt, student loans. So I heard where many large employers here lately are saying they'll do the training on the job, they'll pay for your education, tuition reimbursement. Some employers are even, you know, paying for the loan, you know, giving you something toward a loan. And I know that, you know, city government can't do a lot of that stuff. Nonprofits can't do a lot of that stuff, but they're looking for ways to help people acquire the knowledge they need. And so they're making some changes around education. If single family housing is what is preferred, then looking at ways to making loans available, low interest loans, first time loans, or helping people with special programs to fix up their home with zero interest loans that makes their property more valuable so that they can get out of this cycle of not being able to get insurance, not create wealth, or having to pay extremely high rates for insurance just because of where they're located, but community improvement. So there are ways to do it, but like we said, it's a couple of 100 years, but you got to start somewhere. And we always do encourage people to look at where you were now, where you want to be. And it may be a city you compare yourself to, but it's most important that you compare yourself to yourself. Any
I
other
might also-
questions?
Oh, I
Oh,
was
I'm
just
sorry,
gonna say,
Maya.
no, that's all right. I just wanted to add one more thing too. Doing what you're doing today by hearing from us, people with different perspectives, is also such a huge step already to begin with. One of the things that we really, we kept saying, like, nothing about us without us. So making sure that you're hearing from people who may have identities that are different from you, that are within your community, really hearing from them and hearing what they are thinking is really important to hear. Maybe even families and identity, like people with identities that want to move there that can't currently, but they're like, yeah, this is really where I want to go. This is something that you can really include them in. And so, are there some things that we're missing? Are there some things that we could think about? Say, I don't know the makeup of your group, but you may want to invite people who just don't have those same identities, just so you can hear their perspective and what they've experienced. Maybe say for instance, occupancy permits maybe didn't affect anybody on this group. I'm not totally sure about that, if that's true or not. But if that's the case, then you can maybe talk to people who have been affected by that, right? And see what are their thoughts, what are the things that they've faced. I've been in situations where I've had friends who've gotten cited in my own city for occupation permits, and they go and then they dispute it, and they're like, the person who's in charge of that is like, I have no idea why you were written up to begin with. And that was an experience I would have never known if I didn't talk to them. And so that's fueled some change there in some of the processes that have happened. So little things like that, just hearing from people who are affected by that is going to make a huge difference. And also just hearing from people with different perspectives, such as Gloria and I.
I think Councilmember Bliss, do you have a question?
Hi there, thank you.
Hi.
Yeah, I just wanted to I had a couple comments. It is good for us to hear this again. I think the perspective here on governance is different than the one council went through a year ago. And I think the whole idea of nothing about us without us is ringing true right now. It was the workforce housing for the development that was another thing that was kind of rejected by the community. But my other question is, what is your experience? I know we're talking about length of time it will take for change, but what is your perspective on the arc of change you've seen within an organization or within a government? And with that, you can mute me.
The length of time, where the change has happened, probably where they've turned the curve, so to speak.
Yes.
Okay. I will be honest with you. Most of our clients, we've been with one city since 2006. The other cities we've come in and we have done their work with the survey, the focus groups, the interviews, and they are really only in the first year. But the city that we were with since 2000, from 2006 to actually we're there with them now, but we're not doing a lot of DEI work. I'm going to say it took them about 6 years. Their mayor wanted the change, city manager wanted the change, and the division heads of their utility department, all of their fire, police. We worked with them through 2019, right before COVID. They all wanted to see a change. So they had a strategy around it. They had focus groups, they had interviews, they had a survey, they had change in policies and practices. There were some things that the mayor could do, some things that had to be voted on. But I'm going to say it's an ongoing process, but we worked with them from 2006 up until 2012 on a regular basis. Then we stopped working with them and we went back to work with them up until about from, I think it was probably 2014 to just 2019, right before COVID, when they trained their whole police and fire department on DEI. But it was about a 5 or 6 year journey. It was a political journey. I'm going to be honest with you. People were wondering, what are you all doing here? What are you talking about? This looks like we're excluding people. It looks like reverse discrimination. We focus more on internal than we did on external. So we had people that were very skeptical. I remember having to stop a DEI activity training we were doing because people were like, you're going to know what I'm saying and who I'm saying it about, and I'm not comfortable. I mean, we experienced everything with this particular client. People didn't trust us. People didn't trust the city manager. It was an interesting journey, and it took us about 6 years.
I think it's
But-
also important to really, oh, I'm sorry, Gloria, go
No,
ahead.
no, Maya, please go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that it's also really important to be realistic about change, about people will resist this,
Mhm.
people will push back, and they're, you know, sometimes their concerns are really valid and they do need to be listened to. And I would say most times these are like misconceptions. They think that there are some issues with this, that they have no idea how it's actually going to affect them. So they're dealing with rumors and trying to figure out, okay, what does this really mean for me? So we have this figure that we sometimes show for, it's a change curve. And it's really just showing, like, you know, people are, you know, steady on where they're at, and then it dips down whenever that change starts to occur, whenever it relates to productivity. And then after that change starts to adapt, we start to see some of those solutions be put in place, and people realize, oh, this is actually not as scary as it is. Oh, I can actually do this pretty well. This is something that's within my capabilities, something within my comfort level. I know how to talk about this now. Then it goes up, and actually that productivity goes beyond the level that you were at before. So it's hard. It takes a long time. It takes, you know, 5, 6, 7 years to really see some of that change, get to that really full productivity part. But it's really helpful because you're able to go down, see what the issues are, and then overcome those, and then inevitably get better than you were before. And so that's really what we're going for, right? We want to be better than we were before. And even if that means that we have to dip for a little bit, that's okay, because there's still that curve, and that's a curve that is established in a lot of change literature. So this is not something that is just sort of like something that we're talking about. There's researchers that have been talking about this for decades. They're just like, yeah, this is just how it happens. It's just how it goes. But ultimately where you end is somewhere better than you were before. So that's ultimately that goal.
And what we know when you're in those lulls, you know, it's betrayal, it's denial, it's self-identity crisis. We know you need information, you need training, you need nurturing, you need coaching, you need communications that is consistent to get you out of that denial, identity crisis mode. You know, we had people saying, you know, we're going to be giving jobs to people who don't deserve them. This is reverse discrimination. And we explained the equity piece. We explained it's not affirmative action. We had to have messaging for different groups at various different times. We knew that people were going to be fearful of keeping their jobs for whatever reason. We had to talk to them about retooling and skills and resources that would be available. We had to let them know that we weren't picking people just because they fit a certain diversity characteristic. We had to talk to them about job qualifications, what remained the job qualifications. And so we had to spend a lot of time in training, education, information, nurturing, coaching, soothing, all of those things. And guess what? Different people are at different stages in that change curve. So it's like trying to get everybody on the same page at one time is not possible. That's why we say you got to have a strong communication strategy. People need to know why you're doing it, how you're going to be better, why you need to be better, how this will positively impact them and the organization. And then there are times where there are going to be people that will never be on board. Hopefully that is less than 20% of your population. You have to decide to move on from those individuals. Sometimes it becomes a performance matter for people who cannot, will not, won't change.
Yeah, that communication piece is so important. I feel like that's probably one of, I don't think that we've done a single assessment for any city that has not included some recommendation for you need to communicate constantly. You need to talk about what this is really going to be. You need to really really push away all those misconceptions. Tell them, tell them what's actually going on, how this actually works. And part of this is having like education like this, like these lectures, having the language to use this, having an understanding of diversity, equity, inclusion. It's so helpful just to be able to communicate this. And now there's more community members that can start talking about this and have this background. So that's already helpful. But if there's huge changes that you want to do with the charter that you need to garner support for from your community to get a vote on, maybe that's the point where you start saying, this is why we're doing this. If that can't be necessarily on a ballot, like why you can't bring up the why on the ballot, you can start talking to your community and start saying, hey, this is why we're wanting to do this. And if somebody says, oh, we don't need that, that's useless, or oh, this is going to hurt us, you give them that information and say, hey, I don't think that this is actually going to do what you think it's going to do. This is actually going to be helping everything. It's going to help you and your family in the long run too. And really giving them that information and, truly just getting rid of those misconceptions, writing all these facts, making sure that everybody really knows what's going to go on.
Well, thank you very much. You've given us a lot to think about, and I think you've been very helpful. And if there are any final comments? No, thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you for having us.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you.
Thank you, guys. Have a good evening.
All right,
Thank
you do the
See you
same.
later.
Good night.
Good night.
So we're coming to our end of our time. Would the pleasure of the board be to put off discussing Section 8 Department of Law and old business? Joe, do you have anything quickly about your compensation committee?
Yes, Madam Chairman, the infamous compensation subcommittee has met both in mid-December and then for a half hour here this evening. And I think we have a consensus of and I'll just briefly mention it to the group, that we're in favor of moving from a per meeting compensation approach, which is currently in place here, to a monthly compensation, and that we would at least propose that the board here consider compensation levels of about for council members of $400 per month, and for the mayor $600 per month, with all the other caveats around, this doesn't go into effect until a new term and that and such. This is the compensation level used by Creve Corps, which we, among the several options that Mayor Arnold and staff had provided to us, we thought kind of gave us a good starting point. The board can look at maybe adjusting that in terms of levels or even proportion between the mayor and the council members and go from that route. And so I defer to John or Jennifer if they have anything else to add.
It's something that we definitely need to review and maybe do it at the next meeting or two, because Webster Groves is at the very, very, very bottom of all compensations around here. And
there's two different dates. They said this dates back to 1954. And they said there was a pay adjustment back in 1965. We're still waiting on confirmation on when. But if you just take the rate of inflation since 1965, the figures that we came up with Creve Coeur are very, very proportionate to where it needs to be.
Okay, we'll put that on for,
So
Okay.
whenever you want to put this on the schedule, I think the other thing that our subcommittee was considering is that this would be probably an appropriate topic to bring up for public engagement in some fashion.
right,
Whether that's as part of just comments or a survey, or even a discussion of a couple of options. I think we need to kind of think that part through.
okay. Well, thank you for your work on that, you committee members, and we'll take it up. So the next, we'll put that on for another meeting, and then our next meeting is going to be the wards versus at-large elections and term limits. Dr. Andrea Benjamin on the 23rd. And then we want to get to, I know there was discussion last time about the meeting, making it longer, not meeting as much. And I don't think, as far as I know, there was no final decision. And where do we want to go from here? We do need to find a different date for the 20th, because that's a holiday.
Madam Chair, you may have said this, but the next two confirmed meeting dates are January 23rd and February 6th.
Oh, right. And then February 20th is,
Is the
Not
holiday, so we
good.
need an alternative date for that.
Okay.
Or we could take it off.
yeah,
Correct.
Madam Chair, in that working schedule that I had circulated to folks, and Tammy has copy also. It just kind of bring it to mind that looking at it at the current pace and the amount of time we are devoting to issues and discussion and walkthrough, that at least my best guess is that we're looking at, through March, having meetings twice a month in order to get to early April, having gone through the whole charter, and then be ready to start going back through and doing specific proposals and discussions of those. Now, if we want to approach that a different way, that's entirely up to the board, and just reminding that in terms of scheduling, that's kind of where we're at.
Yeah.
Whether if we make the sessions longer, we move faster, we limit somehow, and obviously I think the next session, given the way this one went, I would assume that the next session will be the full 2 hours again.
right, yeah. So if we would have done Department of Law, we'd be halfway through the charter. And I think there was comment last time at last meeting, which I wasn't here, that things are going to get more complicated as we go forward. So, and I know, Paul, Mondays after 7 don't work for you.
Yeah, I could maybe work around it, but to me, 2 hours is long enough.
So something else that had been proposed outside of the meeting after the last meeting was considering people, the members of the board reviewing the charter, like similar to the way the city did, and marking areas that were of importance. And to do some of that prior to coming in, so that we're not literally reading through every line of the charter and waiting and asking for questions, is that we can prioritize and maybe triage some of the things that we want to spend more time on.
So personally, I've already done that with, I've got all of my comments, so I got a lot of stuff for that, so absolutely we have to do that on our own. But we have to share that with each other as well.
Right.
Well, and I think that that's a good idea, but then suppose there's divergent opinions, one person sees it one way, and then, so then there's have to be discussion, and that's appropriate.
I don't know if that saves any time. The city, we've already looked at what the city has provided, and it doesn't seem to me that's any quicker than not. Because
Yeah.
there, it assumes that everybody's gonna see it the same way.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, which won't happen.
We haven't yet, so.
No.
Yeah, I think a first sweep through, I think from my viewpoint, it works best if we're all on the same wavelength and together, but, so does the committee want to continue to meet every other week till through March till we get this done? I mean, some pieces.
Is there
of it-
anyone else that has conflicts?
I have some conflicts, but I'm willing to, we have great momentum going right now, so I'll make concessions and keep it rolling the way it is so that we can keep with this timeline that we pretty much have. Mine is just work, but I can kind of I know how I can get around it. Salary, so.
Okay.
And my conflicts are once we get to the end of March, then I'm gonna run into class on Monday nights, so I'm gonna miss most of the dates unless we switch days, but until the end of March, I'm good.
Okay. Well, should we proceed through the end of March and then reevaluate?
Taking off February 20th.
Or are we doing that week at a different day? Like February 22nd or something. I don't know what the options are.
Yeah. Well, what, for the city, Dr. Peoples, what works for you?
Well, what's the calendar for February? I would say we can make most dates in March work.
Or February.
February, I'm sorry. I'm looking at February, but it said March. So we already have February 6th. So with the 20th being a holiday, are you still wanting to meet that week, or would you want to go?
We do the 22nd.
That's court night.
Okay, that's a no.
So thank you.
To know. The 23rd would work for this week.
23rd is a Thursday.
Thursday, February 23rd. Does that work for everyone?
I couldn't do it until later. It would be a conflict for me. Or the previous Thursday.
Mm,
The previous Wednesday does work, the 15th, if you want to do it ahead of that.
The 15th?
The 15th is open.
Which is fine. That would just be meeting 2 weeks in a row. But we can have the space.
February 15th, okay?
15?
It's a Wednesday.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay.
Right, February 15th instead of February 20th.
Okay, so just to make sure I've got it, we've then got January 23rd, February 6th, February 15th, March 6th, March 20th. And then we'll go back to the drawing board.
Are we talking February 15th at 5 o'clock? Okay.
March 20th only had 6 people available. Is that enough?
Sounds like schedules have changed. So are people available March 6th?
I still didn't receive that Google poll or that doodle poll, so my response isn't in there.
Can you, are you available? Can you share now if you're available March 6th?
March 20th, as far as I know.
I will not be available on March 20th.
Yeah, I will not.
So it sounds like March 10th or 20th is a problem. So I'm going to ask you March 6th before we get to the 20th. Is March 6th the?
March 6th is good.
I assume so. It said 9 people. I thought it was good.
Okay, so I'm hearing yes for the 6th. So then the 20th, Madam Chair, you may want to.
We also got to keep in mind, March 20th is also spring break for a lot of people.
Very good point.
Yeah.
So looking at the March calendars.
The 22nd work, Wednesday.
I'm gone that whole week for spring break. I don't know what other people's conflicts are.
Okay.
I'll be on a cruise ship that week. Yeah.
You what?
I'll be on a cruise ship that week.
And get you a Zoom link.
I paid for Wi-Fi. I don't know if it'll work or
See?
not.
Last week in March, does that have any possibilities for the group?
I'm open all week after that, after the week of the 20th.
27th is a Monday.
And then for me personally, that's where my class will start. So, but
It
it probably
starts
doesn't
now.
affect other people. So if it's just me, then
Eric, is anything happening in the rooms the Wednesday or Thursday of that week?
Wednesday or Thursday?
29th or 30th? Is
Nope, we're good.
that a possibility for anybody?
Yep.
Any preferences in there? On the 29th or 30th?
March 29th, a Wednesday. Okay.
So the 27th is now the 29th.
Um,
I think that's where we're headed.
20th.
The 27th.
I guess that's
March
right before the
29th.
next one.
Right.
That would be a couple, that'd be 4 days before
Yeah.
the next one.
No, so we're doing the 29th instead of the 20th, correct?
Yes, ma'am. That's
Okay.
what I'm hearing.
All right.
And then again on April 3rd.
Yeah. Okay.
January 23rd, February 6th.
Yes.
February 15th,
Mhm.
March 29th, April 3rd, I heard.
Yep.
Okay,
No March 6th.
Yep.
March 6th is gone.
I
No,
didn't hear
it's-
March 6th being gone.
oh, I didn't.
March, okay.
I'm sorry, I may have skipped it.
Okay, March 6th.
March 6th is still on, right?
Okay.
Fun.
Any further discussion?
Madam Chair, the other thing you may want to think about of the group is doing a subcommittee approach also for certain other topics. So just to
Yeah.
hand off to keep things moving.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, everybody. They have a motion to adjourn.
I so move.
Second,
I'll second.
all in favor?
Aye.
Bye.
Thank you.